The old library smelled of dust and secrets. Margaret Hayes had worked there for 43 years, her silver hair always pinned in the same neat bun, her reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain. Everyone knew her. Sweet Margaret, who remembered every patron's favorite genre, who never charged late fees to struggling families, who baked cookies for the summer reading program. But on a gray October morning, while processing returned books in the basement archives, Margaret's trembling hands held something that would shatter her quiet existence forever. A leather diary, its pages yellowed and brittle, tucked inside a book that hadn't been checked out since 1993. The first entry was dated March 1989. The handwriting was neat, almost childlike, and the words described in meticulous detail how to burn a house down with a family sleeping inside. Margaret should have called the police immediately. She should have dropped that diary and walked away, but she didn't. Because as she read further, she realized the crime described wasn't hypothetical. It had happened. The Riverside Street fire. 5 people dead, no survivors, no arrests. And the author of this diary had gotten away with murder for 35 years. Margaret Hayes wasn't supposed to be working that Tuesday morning. She had requested the day off months ago for a doctor's appointment, but when young Thomas called in sick, she couldn't leave the library understaffed. That's how Margaret was. Reliable, dependable, the kind of person who faded into the background of every room she entered. She arrived at 7:30, made her usual pot of weak coffee in the staff room, and descended into the archives where returned books waited in their wooden crates like patient children. The basement always made her uneasy. Flickering fluorescent lights, the constant drip from pipes overhead, shadows that seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. But Margaret had faced her fears every day for 4 decades, so she simply adjusted her glasses and began scanning barcodes. The book was wedged at the bottom of the 3rd crate, The Complete Works of Edgar Allan Poe, checked out on August 14, 1993 by someone named David Brennan, 31 years overdue. Margaret chuckled, calculating the theoretical late fee in her head. $17,000, give or take. As she opened the book to check for damage, the diary tumbled out and landed at her feet. Before we continue this story, drop a comment below and tell us what city you're watching from. Margaret would love to know how far this tale travels. Margaret would love to know how far this tale travels. Margaret would love to know how far this tale travels. Margaret would love to know how far this tale travels. Margaret would love to know how far this tale travels. Margaret would love to know how far this tale travels. Margaret would love to know how far this tale travels. Margaret would love to know how far this tale travels. Margaret would love to know how far this tale travels. Margaret would love to know how far this tale travels. Margaret would love to know how far this tale travels. Margaret would love to know how far this tale travels. Margaret would love to know how far this tale travels. Margaret would love to know how far this tale travels.
Slipped the diary into her cardigan pocket, finished processing the returned books, and went upstairs to open the library at 9 o'clock. She smiled at patrons, checked out books, answered reference questions, all while the diary burned like hot coal against her chest. At lunch, she locked herself in the staff bathroom and read every single entry from beginning to end. The author never used names, referring to the family only as them or the targets. But the details matched perfectly. The house layout, the dog that barked at midnight, the father's blue pickup truck, the mother's garden with the rose bushes. Everything aligned with what Margaret remembered about the Caldwell family. They had lived 4 blocks from the library. Sophie, the oldest daughter, had been one of Margaret's regular patrons, always checking out mystery novels. The author described watching Sophie through her bedroom window as she read by lamplight. The violation of it made Margaret's stomach turn. But here's what troubled her most. The diary described not just the planning and execution, but the aftermath. The author had attended the funeral, had spoken to the surviving relatives, had watched the investigation unfold, documenting every misstep, every wrong conclusion. This person had gotten away with murder and found it amusing. The final pages contained reflections written years later, dated 1993. 4 years have passed. No one suspects. No one will ever know. The perfect crime exists, and I committed it. I am untouchable. Then nothing, just blank pages. Margaret realized the author had hidden the diary in a library book, probably meaning to retrieve it later. But something must have happened. Maybe they moved away. Maybe they forgot which book they'd chosen. Maybe they died. Or maybe they simply didn't need it anymore, confident that their secret was safe forever. Margaret closed the diary and stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. She looked small and old and frightened. But beneath the fear, something else stirred, a determination she hadn't felt in decades. She thought about Sophie Caldwell and those mystery novels. The girl had loved detective stories, had dreamed of solving crimes when she grew up. She never got that chance. But maybe Margaret could solve this one for her. The question was where to begin and how to proceed without alerting the killer that someone had found their confession. For 3 days, Margaret carried the diary everywhere, reading and rereading every word, searching for clues to the author's identity. She couldn't focus on work. She snapped at patrons for the first time in her career. She barely slept, lying awake in her small apartment, imagining the Caldwell family's final moments. The diary provided plenty of detail about the crime, but precious little about the criminal. No physical descriptions, no mention of occupation or personal life, just cold clinical observations and planning. But Margaret had spent 43 years studying human nature through books, and she understood that writers always revealed themselves, even when they tried not to. She began making notes in a small notebook, listing everything she could infer. The author was educated, their vocabulary extensive and precise. They had mobility and freedom, able to conduct surveillance at various hours without arousing suspicion. They understood fire, discussing accelerants and burn patterns with technical knowledge. They felt superior to others, their tone dripping with contempt for the incompetent investigators. And they had access to the library, which meant they were local or had been there at some point. Margaret started her investigation the way she knew best, through research. She spent her lunch breaks in the newspaper archives, reviewing coverage of the fire. The investigation had lasted 6 months before being closed as accidental. The lead investigator was Captain Frank Morrison, now retired. His son, Detective James Morrison, still worked for the department. Margaret knew James slightly. He came to the library occasionally, usually researching historical cases. She could approach him, hand over the diary, let the professionals handle it. But something held her back. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was fear that no one would take her seriously. Or maybe, if she was honest with herself, it was the thrill. For the first time in her life, Margaret felt truly alive. The diary had transformed her from furniture into a person with purpose. She wasn't ready to give that up yet. So instead of calling the police, Margaret did something she had never done in 40 decades of library service. She accessed the patron database and looked up David Brennan, the name attached to the overdue book. The record showed he had registered his library card in 1988 with an address on Maple Street. He had checked out dozens of books over 5 years, mostly true crime and detective fiction, before the account went dormant in 1993.
The year the diary's final entry was written. Margaret's pulse quickened. This had to be him. David Brennan was the killer. But when she searched for current information, she hit a wall. No phone listing, no social media presence, no obituary. David Brennan had vanished as thoroughly as the Caldwell family's justice. She needed to find him, but she had no idea where to start looking, and time was running out. Because someone else knew about the diary, and they were watching her. Margaret didn't notice the man at first. He appeared on Thursday afternoon, shortly after she had searched for David Brennan's information. Average height, maybe 50 years old, wearing a gray jacket and wire-rimmed glasses. He browsed the mystery section for 20 minutes, selected 3 books, and checked them out without incident.
Margaret processed his card automatically, barely glancing at his face. But something about him nagged at her consciousness, a discordant note she couldn't identify. He returned on Friday. Same section, same browsing pattern. But this time he didn't check out any books, just watched. Margaret noticed him staring when she bent to retrieve a dropped pen. The moment their eyes met, he turned away and left quickly. Saturday morning, he was back again. This time, Margaret paid attention. He wasn't browsing at all. He was following her movement through the stacks, maintaining distance but always keeping her in his line of sight. When she went to the staff room for coffee, she positioned herself at the window overlooking the main floor. The man stood at the circulation desk, speaking with Taylor, the weekend assistant. Margaret couldn't hear their conversation, but she saw Taylor shake his head and shrug. The man asked something else. Taylor pointed toward the basement stairs. Margaret's blood turned to ice. He was asking about her, about the archives, about what she'd been working on. She grabbed her purse and the diary, both of which she now kept with her constantly, and slipped out the staff exit. For the first time in 43 years, Margaret Hayes left her post during business hours. She drove home with shaking hands, checking her rearview mirror every second few. No one followed, but that didn't ease her paranoia. Someone knew she had the diary, but who and how? Unless it wasn't about the diary at all. What if David Brennan had been monitoring his old library account somehow? What if her database search had triggered an alert? The technology existed. Margaret didn't understand it fully, but she knew libraries tracked patron activity, and someone tech-savvy could potentially monitor those systems. Or maybe she was being ridiculous. Maybe the man was just an ordinary patron with unusual browsing habits. Maybe paranoia was distorting her perception. But Margaret had read enough mysteries to know that coincidences were rarely just coincidences, and the timing was too perfect to ignore. That night, she made copies of the diary's most important pages using her home printer. She placed the originals in a manila envelope and wrote a letter to Detective Morrison explaining everything. She addressed it, stamped it, and set it on her kitchen table. If anything happened to her, her neighbor had instructions to mail it. The precaution felt melodramatic, like something from one of Sophie Caldwell's beloved mystery novels, but it also felt necessary. Margaret was in over her head, swimming in waters too deep and dark for an old librarian, and she needed to find David Brennan before he found her, because she was certain now that he was looking. Monday morning arrived with autumn rain, the kind that turned everything gray and somber. Margaret drove to the library early, before sunrise, and parked in her usual spot. The building loomed dark and empty, just as she liked it. She had 90 minutes before opening, 90 minutes to search through old records she couldn't access with witnesses present. They needed patron registration forms from 1988, paper archives that predated the digital system. They were stored in the basement, naturally. Everything important always ended up in that damp, shadowy basement. Margaret unlocked the staff entrance and disarmed the security system. The building settled around her with familiar creaks and sighs. She had spent more time here than in her own home over the decades. She knew every sound, every smell, every quirk. She descended the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the stairwell. The archive smelled stronger than usual, must and mildew and slowly decaying paper. She found the filing cabinet marked 1988 to 1992 and pulled it open. Registration forms were organized by month. She flipped through August 1988 until she found it. David Brennan. The handwriting was the same, precise, mechanical, slightly slanted to the right. Seeing it on an official form, seeing proof that this person had stood in this library and filled out this card, made everything horrifyingly real. The address listed
Was 247 Maple Street, phone number included. Margaret photographed the form with her cell phone, then searched for any other records associated with that name. She found 3 more items: a reference request from September 1988 asking for books about arson investigation,
A complaint form from March 1989, someone had reported David Brennan for disturbing behavior in the reading room, though no details were provided, and a notice from June 1993, informing him that his overdue books had accumulated significant fees and his account would be suspended until payment was received. He never paid, never returned the books, just disappeared. Margaret was photographing the complaint form when she heard it. A door closing upstairs, soft but distinct. Then footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving across the main floor directly above her head. Someone else was in the library. The building was supposed to be empty, locked, alarmed, but someone had gotten inside. Margaret's heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. She stood perfectly still, barely breathing, listening to those footsteps. They moved toward the basement stairs. Stopped. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Then the footsteps descended. 1 step, 2, 3. Margaret looked around desperately. The basement was a maze of shelves and boxes, but there was only one exit. The stairs, where someone was now descending. She was trapped. The footsteps reached the bottom. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was the man in the gray jacket. But this time, Margaret could see his face clearly in the fluorescent light. And she recognized him. Not from recent memory, but from decades past. From a funeral she had attended in 1989, where a young man had stood at the back of the church watching with dry eyes as they eulogized the Caldwell family. David Brennan had come back, and he knew exactly what Margaret had found. "Hello, Margaret." His voice was pleasant, almost friendly, the kind of voice that belonged to a teacher or a pastor. Nothing in his tone suggested danger, yet every instinct screamed at Margaret to run. "I've been waiting a long time for someone to find that diary. I honestly thought it would be sooner. 31 years is quite a wait, don't you think?" Margaret couldn't speak. Her mouth had gone completely dry. David took a step closer, hands visible and empty, his expression curious rather than threatening. He looked so ordinary. That was the terrifying part. Not a monster, just a middle-aged man who could have been anyone's neighbor, anyone's coworker, anyone's friend. "You've been very busy, Margaret. Searching databases, copying documents, playing detective." He smiled. "I've been monitoring my old library account for years, just in case. Call it vanity, but I wanted to know if anyone ever discovered my masterpiece. Technology makes surveillance so easy now. When your system pinged my alert last Tuesday, I knew someone had finally found it. I had to come see who." Margaret's hand slowly moved toward her purse where her phone rested, but David shook his head gently. "Please don't. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here because I'm curious. What are you planning to do with the diary? Turn it over to the police? Try to be a hero?" Finally, Margaret found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "You murdered 5 people, a whole family, children." "I removed obstacles," David corrected, as if discussing gardening. "Richard Caldwell had information that would have destroyed my father's business. False information, I should mention, but convincing enough to cause problems. I tried the legal route first. Lawyers, negotiations, threats. Nothing worked. He was stubborn, self-righteous. So I solved the problem permanently." "The children," Margaret repeated, louder now. "They were innocent." "Collateral damage." David shrugged. "The fire had to look accidental. If only the parents died, it would have raised suspicions. Besides, those children would have grown up bitter, damaged, seeking revenge. I did them a favor, really. Quick and painless. They never woke up." The casual cruelty in his words ignited something in Margaret. Fear transformed into fury. This man, this monster wearing human skin, had stolen 5 lives and felt nothing. No remorse, no guilt, just pride in his perfect crime. "I've already made copies," Margaret said, straightening her spine. If anything happens to me, they go straight to the police. You'll spend the rest of your life in prison." David laughed, a genuine sound of amusement. "Oh, Margaret! Sweet, naive Margaret. Do you really think I'm the same person who wrote that diary? That address on Maple Street belongs to someone who doesn't exist anymore. David Brennan died in a car accident in 1995, according to official records. I've been someone else for 30 years. New name, new life, new identity. That diary is just words on paper. No forensic evidence, no DNA, no proof whatsoever."
Connects it to the actual crime. He was right, and Margaret knew it. The diary alone wouldn't be enough. Too much time had passed. Evidence had been lost or destroyed. Witnesses had died or forgotten. David Brennan, or whatever he called himself now, had truly gotten away with murder. But as Margaret looked into his cold, empty eyes, she realized something. He hadn't come here to kill her. He had come here because he needed her to know, needed someone, anyone to acknowledge his brilliance. His ego had brought him back. And ego, Margaret understood from decades of reading, was always a weakness. She smiled, a small, knowing smile that clearly surprised him. "You're right," she said softly. "You probably will get away with it, just like you said in the diary. The perfect crime, unsolvable. But there's one thing I don't understand." David tilted his head, curious. "What's that?" "If it was so perfect, why did you write it all down? Why create evidence of your guilt and hide it in a library book? That seems careless for someone so meticulous." For the first time, something flickered across David's face. Uncertainty. He opened his mouth to answer, but before he could speak, the basement lights went out, plunging them into absolute darkness. And Margaret Hayes disappeared into the shadows she had known for 43 years, leaving David Brennan alone with his perfect crime and the terrible question of what would happen next.